My name is Jessie Calloway, and I was 31 years old the summer I found out my father had sold the farm. My grandfather spent 50 years building, and done it while my grandfather was still breathing. He'd signed the papers in February. Grandpa Ray died in March. I didn't find out until June, when a man I'd never seen before drove a surveying truck down the gravel lane and told me I had 60 days to vacate the property I'd been farming since I was old enough to drive a tractor. My father didn't call to warn me. He didn't call to explain. He called 2 days later to tell me I'd been living rent-free on his generosity for years and that I ought to be grateful for the 60 days instead of angry about them. I hung up the phone, walked out to the barn, sat down in the hay next to my grandfather's old John Deere, and I didn't move for a long time. Then I did the only thing I knew how to do when something stopped making sense. I started pulling on the thread. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones finally get heard. This channel is for the people who answer cruelty with patience and injustice with proof. If that sounds like your life, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe, drop a comment, and stay with me because this story goes a long way before it goes right. Before any of this, there was a farm. Calloway land sat on 240 acres of river bottom ground in southern Indiana, the kind of soil that's almost embarrassingly good, dark, and deep and patient. Ray Calloway had bought the first 80 acres in 1971, with money saved from 12 years of working other men's fields. He'd added parcels over the decades the way a careful man adds things, slowly and with intention, never buying more than the land could pay for. By the time I was born, the farm was real. By the time I was old enough to understand it, it was everything. My grandfather raised corn and soybeans on the river ground and kept a small cow-calf operation on the higher acres. He was not a rich man by any measure that shows up in magazines, but he was the kind of man whose word was worth more than most people's signatures. And he never forgot a favor done or a wrong committed. He kept both columns in his head with equal precision. I am his daughter's son. My mother, Carol, was Ray's only child, and she married my father, Dennis Calloway, when she was 22. Dennis took the name because Ray asked him to, because there was no one else to carry it. And Dennis agreed because the farm was there, and opportunity had a way of looking like love when you were young and ambitious and standing on 200 acres of good ground. My mother died when I was 11, a fast cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate. After that, it was just Ray and Dennis and me in the farmhouse. 3 men in a house built for a family, each of us grieving in the particular way our personalities allowed. Ray worked. I followed him. Dennis started spending more time in town. By the time I was 16, I knew every field on that farm by its nickname, every low spot that pooled water in a wet spring, every fence line that needed tending before the cattle found it. Ray didn't teach me farming the way a teacher teaches. He taught it the way water cuts a canyon, constant and unhurried. And one day I looked up and I knew things I didn't remember learning. Dennis never had that relationship with the land. He managed it from a distance, signed what needed to sing, showed up for harvest when the numbers were good, and filed the taxes. He wasn't lazy exactly. He just treated the farm the way some people treat a pension fund, something that existed to produce returns rather than something that required belonging to. Ray saw it. He never said it directly to me, but I watched him watch my father, and I understood what those long silences meant. When Ray got sick in his early 80s, it was me who moved back into the farmhouse. I'd done 2 years at the agricultural college and come home anyway, because the farm needed someone there full-time, and Dennis had a life in the city that had quietly become his primary one. I didn't resent it then. I told myself we each had our roles, and mine was the one I'd have chosen anyway. I was farming Ray's ground, living in Ray's house, repairing Ray's equipment, and somewhere in the back of my mind I assumed that when the time came, the farm would pass the way things pass in families, where the work speaks louder than the paperwork. Assumed. That word would come back to haunt me. Ray declined slowly through the winter of his last year. He was still sharp in conversation, still asked about the fields and the cattle prices and whether I'd fixed the drainage tile in the east bottom that had been backing up since October. But he was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix, and we both knew what kind of tired that was. Dennis came down from Indianapolis more regularly those last few months. I noticed, but I didn't think much of it. A man visiting his dying father-in-law seemed like the right thing. and I was too busy with the farm and the caregiving to look hard at the quality of the visits. What I didn't know, what I had absolutely no reason to suspect, was that Dennis had been talking to a land company called Meridian Agricultural Partners since the previous fall. While I was pulling calves in January cold and nursing Ray through his bad nights, my father was negotiating the sale of 240 acres of Calloway, ground to a corporate farming operation out of Columbus. The papers were signed in February, 6 weeks before Ray died, on a day I was in town getting parts for the grain dryer. Ray's signature was on those papers. I need you to hold that fact for a moment because it's the thing that made everything afterward so complicated and so painful. My grandfather's name was on the deed transfer, which meant that on the surface, the story my father could tell was a clean one. A competent adult had sold his own property, legally unambiguous. Closed. Except Ray Calloway had a will. I knew this because he'd told me about it. Not in a dramatic way, not sitting me down for a formal conversation, but the way Ray told me everything important, sideways and practical, while we were doing something else. We'd been checking fence on the north pasture 2 summers before he got sick, and he'd stopped at the corner post and looked out at the river ground and said, "I've had everything put in order, Jesse. The farm goes to you. Dennis gets the equipment and a cash payment. I want you to know that so you're not surprised." I'd nodded and we'd kept walking the fence line and I'd never raised it again because raising it felt like hurrying him. And you don't hurry a man like Ray Calloway. But I knew. The farm was supposed to come to me. So when the surveyor showed up in June and told me about the February sale, my first thought wasn't grief or rage. It was arithmetic. If Ray had a will leaving the farm to me, and the farm had been sold in February while Ray was alive, then either Ray had changed his mind and sold it himself, or someone had gotten him to sign something he didn't fully understand, or something else had happened that I didn't have the shape of yet. I needed to know which one. I called Dennis that evening before he called me and I asked him directly, "Did Grandpa Ray sell the farm in February?" There was a pause just slightly too long to be casual. "He did," Dennis said. "It was his land to sell, Jesse. He wanted the money liquid before he passed. He didn't want the estate to get complicated." I asked why no one had told me. Dennis said Ray had wanted it handled quietly, that he'd been worried I'd try to talk him out of it. I said that didn't sound like Ray. Dennis said people change when they're dying, and that I needed to accept reality and start making plans. I thanked him for his time and I ended the call and I sat with that conversation for a long while, turning it over the way you turn a rock to see what's living underneath. 3 things were wrong with what he'd said. First, Ray Calloway did not make major decisions quietly. He made them carefully, but he told the people affected. That was who he was. Second, the idea that Ray was afraid I'd talk him out of it was backwards. Ray had never in his life been talked out of anything he'd genuinely decided. And third, the timing. 6 weeks before he died, during the hardest stretch of his illness, when he was on increased medication and sleeping 14 hours a day. That was when he decided to sell the farm he'd spent 50 years building. That was when Dennis had gotten his signature. I am a farmer by training and temperament, which means I am not a legal professional. But I am also Ray Calloway's grandson, which means I do not give up when the answer matters, and I know how to work a problem methodically even when I'm tired and even when it hurts. The county recorder's office is public. I drove there on a Thursday morning and pulled the deed transfer. It was all there in official, recorded language. The transfer of 240 acres from Ray Calloway to Meridian Agricultural Partners, dated February 14th, recorded February 28th. The consideration listed was $800,000. I knew what that ground was worth on the current market. I followed land prices the way my grandfather had taught me, the way you follow the weather. $800,000 for that ground was low. Not absurdly low, not fraudulently low, in an obvious way, but below what a properly marketed sale with competitive bidders would have brought. Maybe $120,000 below fair value on that market. Someone had gotten a deal. And the someone who'd brokered it was listed as the seller's representative on the transfer documents. A real estate firm out of Indianapolis called Cornerstone Property Group. I wrote the name down. Then, I drove to the county probate court and pulled my grandfather's estate file. because Ray had died in March and someone would have filed something by June. Dennis had filed as administrator of the estate, citing that Ray had died without a will. I read that sentence 3 times. Ray had died without a will. I thought about the north pasture fence line. I thought about the corner post and the river ground spread out below us and my grandfather looking out at it and saying, "I've had everything put in order, Jesse. The farm goes to you." I drove home and I did not say anything to anyone for 2 days. I just farmed and thought and let the anger burn down to something I could actually work with. Then I started pulling the thread for real. If Ray had a will, it had to have been prepared somewhere. Wills don't write themselves. An attorney drafts them, a notary witnesses them. There's a process. I needed to find where Ray had done his estate planning. The problem was that Ray had been a private man about certain things, and his legal business was one of them. I didn't know which attorney he'd used because he'd never needed to mention it. You don't tell people you've made a will, generally. You just make one and trust the system. I started with what I knew. Ray had driven himself to appointments until he was about 78. And after that, he'd relied on me, or occasionally on his neighbor, Earl Fitch, to take him anywhere he needed to go. I called Earl, who was 80 and still sharp, and asked if he remembered taking Ray to any legal appointments in the last several years. Earl thought about it for a moment and then said yes, actually. He'd driven Ray into Clarksburg 2 years back, to the law office on Merchant Street. Ray had gone in alone and been inside about an hour and come out looking satisfied. Said he'd crossed something off his list. The law office on Merchant Street in Clarksburg. I drove there the next morning. The office belonged to an attorney named Patricia Vander, a sole practitioner who'd been doing wills and real estate work in that county for over 20 years. I walked in without an appointment and asked to speak with her about a matter related to my grandfather's estate. She came out herself, a practical-looking woman in her early 50s, who assessed me in about 3 seconds and invited me back to her office. I told her my grandfather's name. I told her the date Earl had given me. I told her I had reason to believe Ray had done estate planning work with her office, and that his estate was currently being filed as if he'd died without a will. Patricia Vander looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the wall. Then she folded her hands on her desk and said something I hadn't expected. "I've been wondering when someone from that family was going to come through my door," she said. Attorney-client privilege is a real and serious thing, and Patricia Vander was not careless with it. But there are limits and exceptions, and one of them is this. When a client dies, certain duties to that client survive, including the duty not to let their estate be fraudulently administered against their expressed wishes. She had read the probate notice in the county paper, the same as Ruth Howren had in the last story, and she had been sitting with it uncomfortably for weeks. She couldn't hand me the file. She could tell me that a file existed. She could tell me that Ray Calloway had been her client and had executed a valid will in her office. And she could tell me that she had the original document and that she had been trying to determine the appropriate course of action since seeing his estate filed as intestate. Ray's will was sitting in Patricia Vander's fireproof filing cabinet, 17 miles from the farm, that should have passed under it. I sat back in my chair and felt the specific relief of a man who has been holding his breath without knowing it. She walked me through what she could share. Ray had come to her office exactly as Earl had described. He had been accompanied to the appointment by no one. He had been mentally clear, appropriately deliberate, and had given every indication of a person making thoughtful and voluntary decisions about his estate. She had no concerns about his capacity at that time. He had signed the will in her presence and in the presence of her office assistant, who had also signed as a witness. She had retained the original per Ray's request. The will, she told me carefully, disposed of his real property in a manner consistent with what he'd told me at the fence line. But here was the complicated part, and she didn't minimize it. The farm had already been sold. The deed had already transferred. The money, $800,000, had gone into an account in Ray's name, and from there, Patricia didn't know. Whatever the will said about real property, the real property was gone. What was left was the money, assuming it was still there, and the question of whether the sale itself had been legitimate. That second question, she said, was not her territory. That was a question for a different kind of attorney. and possibly for law enforcement. But she could file the will with the probate court and contest Dennis's administration of the estate, which would at minimum stop him from distributing assets while the questions got answered. She asked if I wanted her to do that. I said yes. And then I asked her one more question. Is there any circumstance under which Ray would have voluntarily sold that farm 6 weeks before he died? Patricia Vander looked out her window at the street. The man I met in this office 2 years ago, she said carefully, loved that farm the way some people love their children. He talked about it for 45 minutes before we got to the legal work. He told me about the soil and the river and a grandson who knew every fence line by heart. She looked back at me. So no, she said, not voluntarily, not in my judgment. I hired my own attorney, a man named Gordon Sievert, who did litigation and estate work out of the county seat, and who came recommended by the only 2 people I trusted completely. Earl Fitch and my grandfather's longtime accountant, a woman named Bev Troutman, who had done Ray's farm taxes for 15 years. Bev turned out to be important in ways I hadn't anticipated. When I went to see her, partly to get background on the farm's financials, and partly because she had known Ray for decades and I wanted her read on things, she pulled out her files without being asked and set them on the desk between us and said she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right questions since she'd seen probate notice. The farm's financials, she told me, had been straightforward and healthy right up until Ray got sick. Modest debt, good cash flow, machineries mostly paid off. There was no financial pressure that would have driven a sale. No unpaid bills piling up, no operating loan coming due that couldn't be serviced, nothing. The farm was not a drowning operation grasping for a life preserver. It was a solvent, functioning business with a lifetime of equity built into it. She also told me something else. Dennis had called her in January, 2 months before Ray died and 1 month before the sale was signed, asking for a full accounting of the farm's assets, the land value, the equipment, the cattle inventory. He'd framed it as wanting to understand the estate for planning purposes. She'd provided it because he was Ray's son-in-law, and there was no obvious reason not to. She handed me the copy of what she'd sent him. A clean spreadsheet of everything Ray owned and what it was worth. I looked at it and then I looked at her. He needed to know the numbers before he could negotiate the sale, I said. Bev nodded once, her face tight. That's the conclusion I've been sitting with, yes. Gordon Sievert was methodical and calm and not given to dramatic statements, which suited me perfectly. When I laid everything out for him, the will in Patricia's office, the below-market sale, the timing, the accounting request from Dennis in January, Bev's records, he listened without interrupting, and then he sat quietly for a moment, and then he started writing. The legal situation, he explained, had several layers, and I needed to understand all of them. Layer 1 was the estate. Patricia would file the will, Dennis's appointment as administrator without a will would be challenged, and the probate court would need to sort out the actual estate, which now consisted primarily of whatever money remained from the farm sale rather than the farm itself. Layer 2 was the sale itself. This was where things got complicated and potentially very serious. If Ray had possessed legal capacity when he signed the transfer documents, and if he had signed them voluntarily, then the sale was valid regardless of what his will said. A person can sell their property at any time. The will only controls what's left at death. If Ray had sold the farm and died with the money, the will would govern the money, not the farm. But if Ray had not possessed legal capacity when he signed, the sale was potentially voidable. And if he had been induced to sign through undue influence, through pressure or manipulation by someone in a position of trust, the sale could be challenged on those grounds as well. Layer 3 was the money. $800,000 had gone somewhere. Dennis had filed the estate as if Ray died without significant assets, which meant either the money was being hidden or it had been moved before Ray died. Either possibility was serious, and the second one, if Dennis had helped himself to the money while Ray was alive and unable to fully track it, crossed into territory that had nothing to do with probate court. Gordon told me we needed 3 things. Ray's medical records from his last 6 months to establish his mental and physical condition at the time of the sale. The financial records showing where the $800,000 had gone after it landed in Ray's account. And whatever documentation existed around the sale itself, the listing agreement, the communications between Dennis and Meridian Agricultural Partners, anything that showed who initiated the transaction and when. Some of those things we could request through the estate proceedings, some we might need to subpoena, and some, Gordon said, choosing his words with care, might ultimately be matters for people with more investigative authority than a probate attorney. I told him to do what needed doing. He nodded and picked up his pen, and I watched him start building the case the same way Ray had built the farm, methodically, one solid thing at a time. Dennis called again while all this was being set in motion. He had a gift for timing that I'd never appreciated before, the ability to reach out right when you most wanted him to stay away. He called on a Sunday evening, voice carrying the particular warmth of a man who wants something and thinks pleasantness is the way to get it. "Jesse," he said, "I've been thinking about you. This has been a hard year for both of us, and I don't want there to be bad blood between us over Ray's passing." I let him talk. He said he understood I might have questions about the farm. He said Ray had made the decision himself, freely and clearly, because he'd wanted to simplify things before he died, and he hadn't wanted me burdened with a property I couldn't afford to buy out the other heirs. He said the money was being handled responsibly, and that my share of whatever remained after expenses would come to me in due time. My share of whatever remained after expenses. I wrote that phrase down on the notepad I'd started keeping by the phone. He moved on to his real point. He said he'd heard I'd been asking questions around the counties, and that he hoped I wasn't going to make this into something adversarial, because Ray would have hated seeing the family fight over his estate. I said I wasn't asking questions to cause trouble. I was asking questions because I had them. He said, and I want you to hear the exact words. Sometimes the people closest to a situation are the last ones to see it clearly, Jesse. Ray loved you, but love doesn't always mean what we want it to mean in terms of what people decide to leave behind. I thanked him for calling, and I told him my attorney would be in touch. The silence on his end lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Ray's medical records told a story that took me 2 evenings to read and that I haven't fully stopped thinking about since. My grandfather had been diagnosed with moderate vascular dementia 8 months before he died. His primary care physician had documented a progressive decline in executive function and short-term memory beginning the previous fall. By January, the month Dennis had called Bev for the financial accounting, Ray's physician had noted in his records that Ray was no longer capable of managing complex financial decisions without assistance, and that a healthcare advocate should be involved in any major choices. By February, the month the sale signed, Ray's condition had declined further. His medication had been increased. His physician's notes from a visit 2 weeks before the signing described a patient who was oriented to person but not reliably to time or circumstance, who had difficulty following multi-step conversations, and who required significant support with daily activities. I read that and I thought about the papers my father had gotten him to sign. A deed transfer. A real estate transaction involving 240 acres and $800,000. A document requiring understanding of what was being given up and what was being received in exchange. I thought about Ray at the fence line 2 years before, clear and direct, and looking out at the river ground, with the particular pride of a man who built something real. I've had everything put in order, Jesse. The farm goes to you. And I thought about who Ray had been in February, according to his own doctor's records. I called Gordon from the farm lane on a Tuesday morning and read him the key entries. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Save those records somewhere safe and get me a copy today. This changes the shape of everything." Meridian Agricultural Partners had a regional office in Columbus, and when Gordon's letter suggesting documentation related to the sale landed on their attorney's desk, the response came back within a week. They were cooperative, which told me immediately that they believed they were innocent parties. Companies that know they've done something wrong don't cooperate quickly with document requests. What their records showed was this. Dennis Calloway had contacted Meridian Agricultural Partners in October of the previous year, identifying himself as the authorized representative of his father-in-law, Ray Calloway. and stating that Ray wished to explore a sale of the Calloway farm. He had provided Bev's financial summary, which he'd requested the following January as part of the transaction documents. He had negotiated the price with Meridian's acquisitions team. He had arranged for the signing. Meridian had never spoken directly with Ray Calloway, not once. Their attorney's letter noted that Dennis had represented himself as having power of attorney over Ray's affairs, and that they had relied on that representation. They had a copy of a power of attorney document signed by Ray, establishing Dennis as his agent for financial matters. Gordon called me with this information, and I sat down on the porch step and looked out at the fields. "When did the power of attorney get signed?" I asked. Gordon said the date on the document was 18 months before Ray died. I said Ray's dementia diagnosis was 8 months before he died. So the power of attorney predated the diagnosis. Gordon said yes, and that a power of attorney signed by a person before cognitive decline is generally valid, and that an agent acting under power of attorney has broad authority unless the document limits it, and that this was going to be one of the more difficult threads to pull. I asked what Dennis had done with the power of attorney that he hadn't told me about. Gordon said that appeared to be the question, and that the answer was in Ray's financial records, which we were now formally requesting through the estate proceedings. The bank records came through on a Thursday, ordered by the probate court after Patricia's will filing threw Dennis's administration into question, and the judge ordered a full accounting. Gordon called me Friday morning and told me to come in. I drove to his office and sat across from his desk, and he pushed a summary sheet across to me without preamble. The $800,000 from the farm sale had landed in Ray's personal checking account on February 28th. Between March 1st and March 19th, the 20 days between the money arriving and Ray's death, $560,000 had been transferred out of Ray's account in 4 transactions. The recipient of all 4 transfers was a joint account held by Dennis Calloway and a woman named Sherry Bates. Ray died on March 21st, with $240,000 remaining in his account. I looked at the numbers for a long time. He moved more than half of it while Ray was still alive, I said. Gordon nodded. Before there was even an estate to administer, I said. Gordon nodded again. So when he filed, claiming Ray died with minimal assets, I said. He'd already taken the majority of those assets for himself, while Ray was technically still living, Gordon said. The estate that he's been administering as if it contained modest value actually should have contained the full proceeds of the farm sale, minus any legitimate expenses. Instead, it contains the remainder after $500,000 was walked out the door. I looked at the name on the joint account. Sherry Bates. I didn't know her. Who is she? I asked. Gordon allowed himself the ghost of a look that wasn't quite a smile. As of 14 months ago, he said, she is Dennis Calloway's wife. They married quietly. You weren't informed. I want to tell you how I felt sitting in that office, because I think it matters to understand why I handled what came next the way I did. I wasn't surprised. That's the strange part. I'd been building toward this answer for weeks, and each piece that arrived confirmed the shape I'd already started to see. What I felt was something heavier than surprise. It was the particular grief of understanding that a person you are first related to is capable of things you would not have believed possible if you hadn't seen the receipts yourself. Dennis had found my grandfather in the last months of his life, diminished and dependent and trusting in the way that the very old and the very sick sometimes become trusting, and he had used a legal document Ray had signed years earlier when he was well to position himself as Ray's representative. He had sold Ray's farm, the land Ray had spent 50 years building acre by careful acre, to a corporate operation for a price below its value, a price that made the deal attractive enough for a quick closing. He had taken the majority of the proceeds before Ray was even in the ground. He had filed the estate as if almost nothing remained because by the time Ray died, almost nothing did remain because Dennis had already moved it. And then he had called me to tell me I should be grateful for 60 days to vacate. I sat with that for a long time. Then I told Gordon to do everything that could legally be done. He said he already had some of it in motion, but that I needed to understand something. The probate court was one arena. What Dennis had done with the power of attorney, moving that money while Ray was alive and legally incompetent, was potentially a different arena entirely. Misuse of a power of attorney to financially exploit a vulnerable adult is, in most states, a criminal matter. He had already, he told me, made a referral to the County Adult Protective Services office and provided them the relevant documentation. I said that was the right call. He said he knew I might have complicated feelings about it given that Dennis was family. I told him the man who sold my grandfather's farm while my grandfather was dying and moved the money into his new wife's joint account before the body was cold, had finished being family at some point. During that process, and I didn't know exactly when, but I was at peace with the conclusion. Gordon nodded and picked up his pen. The hearing in probate court came on a Wednesday in October, 3 months after the surveyor had appeared in my lane. The leaves were turning over the river ground that I could see from the parking lot of the courthouse, the land that was technically owned by Meridian Agricultural Partners now, but that I still thought of in the particular way you think of places that made you who you are. The courtroom wasn't packed the way it might have been in a smaller community where everyone knew everyone. This was his county seat with enough legal business that a contested estate hearing didn't draw a crowd. But there were people there who mattered. Earl Fitch had driven himself 40 minutes to sit in the gallery. Bev Troutman was there with her files. Patricia Vander sat near the front, the original will in a document folder beside her. Dennis arrived with an attorney I didn't recognize, a younger man who looked expensive and slightly uncomfortable, and Dennis himself wore the expression of someone who has decided that confidence is a strategy and is committed to it. He looked at me once across the gallery and the look was meant to be dismissive. It landed different than he intended, I think, because he'd been expecting to see the face of a grieving grandson, and instead he saw someone who had spent 3 months reading bank records. The judge was a man named Aldrich, quiet and deliberate, who had apparently reviewed the filings thoroughly before the hearing because he didn't waste time on preliminaries. He noted that a valid will had been filed by Patricia Vander after Dennis had initiated estate administration claiming intestacy. He noted the discrepancy. He asked Dennis's attorney to address it. The attorney offered that Dennis had been unaware of any will at the time of filing and that his client had acted in good faith. Judge Aldrich looked at Dennis directly and asked when he had last spoken with Ray about his estate plans. Dennis said Ray had told him he'd never gotten around to formalizing anything. The judge nodded and made a note. Patricia Vander took the stand and was methodical and clear. Ray had come to her office voluntarily. He had been mentally competent at that time. She had drafted the will according to his instructions. She had retained the original. She had never been contacted by Dennis Calloway or by anyone representing the estate prior to filing the will herself. The judge asked if Ray had discussed his intentions regarding the farm. Patricia said he had been explicit and detailed on that point. The farm in its entirety was to pass to his grandson, Jesse. He had explained his reasoning without being asked. He had said the land should go to the person who understood it and had committed to it, and that his son-in-law had demonstrated over many years that his relationship to the farm was financial rather than foundational. I heard Dennis's attorney write something quickly on his notepad. The medical records through Beeve's accountant files and Ray's primary care physician, who had submitted a sworn statement. The timeline established clearly that Ray's cognitive decline had been documented and progressive, and that by the time the farm sale was signed in February, Ray's own doctor had recorded him as incapable of managing complex financial decisions. Gordon presented the power of attorney, the Meridian transaction records, and the bank transfers side by side. He walked the judge through it the way you walk someone through a simple math problem. Dennis had obtained authority over Ray's finances through a document signed when Ray was healthy. Dennis had used that authority to negotiate and execute the sale of Ray's primary asset while Ray was legally incompetent to understand or meaningfully consent to that transaction. He had then transferred the majority of the proceeds to himself before Ray died, leaving a reduced estate that he then filed as if it were the whole of Ray's assets. Judge Aldrich listened to all of it without expression. Dennis's attorney cross-examined where he could. He argued that a power of attorney is precisely the instrument designed to allow agents to act on behalf of incapacitated principals, and that Dennis had not exceeded his authority. He argued that the sale price, while perhaps below peak market value, was within a reasonable range. He argued that the transfers of funds represented legitimate management of Ray's assets. Gordon asked one question on redirect that I thought about for a long time afterward. He asked whether an agent acting under power of attorney for an incapacitated principal has the legal authority to transfer the principal's assets to themselves. The answer, as every attorney in that room knew, was no. An agent cannot self-deal. An agent acting under power of attorney owes a fiduciary duty to the principal and is explicitly prohibited from using that authority to enrich themselves. The money Dennis had moved into his joint account with Sherry Bates was not legitimate management of Ray's assets. It was theft from a dying man who trusted him. The word hung in the air of the courtroom without being spoken, but we all heard it. Dennis came apart, but differently than my father had at the porch. He didn't stand up and shout. He went still in a way that was almost worse, the stillness of a man who has just seen the wall and understood there's nothing past it. His attorney requested a recess. Judge Aldrich denied it and continued. He removed Dennis as administrator of the estate. He ordered a full accounting of all funds transferred from Ray's accounts during the final year of Ray's life, including the period the power of attorney was active. He ordered those funds frozen pending further review. He admitted Ray's will to probate. He referred the matter of the power of attorney transfers to the county prosecutor's office and to the state's Adult Protective Services Division for investigation of potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Then he looked at Dennis for a long moment and said something I wrote down in the car afterward because I wanted to remember it exactly. "This court has considerable experience with contested estates," he said. "What is presented here is not a good faith disagreement about a man's intentions. It is a systematic effort to benefit personally from a vulnerable man's diminished capacity while representing yourself as his faithful agent. That representation was false, and the consequences of it will be addressed in this court and likely in others." Dennis's attorney was already leaning over to speak quietly into Dennis's ear. Dennis wasn't listening. He was looking at the table in front of him with the face of a man who has spent months believing that because he'd been careful, he'd been clean, and who is now understanding for the first time that careful and clean are not the same thing when someone else has the bank records. I drove home from the courthouse, through the River Bottom Road, past the fields that were technically someone else's now, but still wore the shape of everything Ray had planted and tended for 50 years. I rolled the window down even though the October air was cold, and I let the smell of the turned ground come in, that particular deep smell that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. I thought about something Patricia Vander had said in her office weeks earlier when I'd asked her why she'd kept the will all this time and not filed it immediately when Ray died. She'd said she hadn't known he was dead until she saw the probate notice. He'd been her client, not a family member, and no one had informed her. She'd been waiting for the family to come to her, the way families usually do, to find out what the attorney had. And when no one came, and then the notice appeared in the paper, listing the estate as having no will, she'd understood that something had gone wrong and she'd been sitting with the weight of it. I asked her if she felt responsible for any of the damage. She'd thought about that honestly. "I kept the will as Ray asked me to," she said. "I can't know what I'm not told. What I can do is what I did, which is file it the moment I understood it was needed." She'd paused. "People think the paperwork is just bureaucracy," she said. "But it's the thing that stands between what someone wanted and what someone else wants them to have wanted. Ray knew that. That's why he came to my office." The criminal investigation moved on its own timeline separate from the estate proceedings, and I won't tell you it was fast or straightforward, because it wasn't. These things rarely are. But I can tell you what happened in the months that followed. The Adult Protective Services investigation confirmed what the bank records showed. The transfers from Ray's account to Dennis's joint account with Sherry Bates constituted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Indiana law. The power of attorney had been used in direct violation of its fiduciary requirements. The prosecutor's office filed charges against Dennis. Financial exploitation of an endangered adult, theft by deception, and misuse of power of attorney. 3 counts each serious. Dennis's expensive attorney negotiated. They negotiated for a long time, What came out the other end was a guilty plea on the exploitation charge, full restitution of the transferred funds to the estate, and a sentence that involved no incarceration but included 3 years of probation and a permanent prohibition on serving as any kind of legal agent or fiduciary for another person. The money came back. Not all at once and not without difficulty, but it came back because Gordon had frozen the accounts before Dennis could move it again, and because Dennis's attorney understood that at a trial with those bank records in evidence was not a favorable outcome for his client. The farm itself was a harder question, and I want to be honest with you about it. Meridian Agricultural Partners had purchased the farm in good faith. They had relied on a power of attorney that was validly executed, even if it was wrongly used. The legal question of whether a third-party innocent purchaser is protected from a voided transaction when fraud is later discovered is genuinely complicated, and Gordon told me early on that I needed to be realistic about the farm itself. We filed a claim against the sale. We argued that the transaction should be voided because Ray lacked capacity to consent, and because his agent had a disqualifying conflict of interest. Meridian's attorneys argued in return, and the arguments were not without merit. What we reached, after 8 months of litigation that I will not detail because it would take another hour to tell, was a settlement. Meridian kept the farm. I couldn't get the land back, and I want to be honest about that loss, because it was real, and it sits in me differently than the money does. The money is numbers. The land was Ray's life's work and my childhood and the smell of turned ground through an open car window. But this settlement included a payment to the estate that made up the difference between what Meridian had paid and the land's fair market value, plus a portion of their projected profits. It wasn't the farm, it was the best available outcome when the farm was already gone. The estate, with the restored funds and the settlement payment, ultimately held just over $1.1 million. Under Ray's will, properly probated, the farm, meaning now the money that stood in its place, came to me. Dennis received the equipment and cash payment Ray had specified, administered by the court and not by Dennis himself for obvious reasons. Earl Fitch helped me move out of the farmhouse on a gray November morning. I didn't have much. Farmers accumulate equipment and debt, not furniture, and most of what was in that house had been Ray's anyway and would stay with the property. We loaded my truck in silence, mostly. Earl is not a talker under ordinary circumstances, and this was not an ordinary circumstance. When we'd gotten the last of it, he stood by his truck and looked at the farmhouse for a long moment. He was real proud of this place, Earl said, and he was real proud of you. I know, I said. Earl nodded. He got in his truck and drove out the lane, and I stood there for another minute, looking at the house and the barn and the fields going down to the river, all of it carrying the shape of Ray's decisions over 50 years. Then I got in my truck and drove out too. I bought ground of my own the following spring. 80 acres south of town, not river bottom, not as good as Calloway ground, but mine. I put a down payment on it, used money from the estate settlement, and I borrowed the rest from a farm credit lender who was willing to take a chance on a young farmer with a demonstrated history of actually knowing what he was doing. It's not the same. I want to be clear that it's not the same, and that I'm not going to tell you the story ends with everything restored and nothing lost, because that would be dishonest, and Ray raised me to be honest about numbers. What I have is mine, every acre of it, every decision I make on it, every crop I put in, every fence I build, belongs to me and to no one else. There's a particular weight to that kind of ownership that I'm still learning to carry, and I think I'll be learning it for the rest of my farming life. Bev Troutman still does my taxes. She came out to see the new place in July and walked the fields with me the way Ray used to walk them. And at the far end, where the ground starts to rise, she stopped and looked back toward the road. "You're going to do all right here, Jessie," she said. I told her I intended to. She asked if I'd heard from Dennis. I said I hadn't and didn't expect to. She nodded, satisfied by that, and we walked back. Dennis finished his probation quietly. I know this because Gordon kept track and told me when it ended. I have not spoken to him since the courthouse parking lot, where we happened to be at the same time after the criminal sentencing, and where he looked at me with something on his face that I couldn't read clearly, whether it was regret or resentment, or just the expression of a man who has been definitively caught and has nothing useful to say about it. I didn't speak to him then either. I had already said what I needed to say in the courtroom through 3 months of records and subpoenas and sworn statements, and that had been enough. The farm is being planted by Meridian's operation now. I drive past it sometimes on my way between jobs, and the fields look the way good fields look when they're being properly farmed, which is at least something. The land doesn't know who owns it. It just does what good ground does. It produces. Ray would have had a complicated opinion about that. He believed land had a relationship to the person working it that was as important as the legal title. He believed farming was a commitment, not just an investment. I carry that belief with me onto my own 80 acres every morning, and I think it's the most valuable thing he left me. More valuable than the money, more valuable even than the land. Because it's the kind of thing that can't be transferred by deed or stolen by power of attorney. It lives in the person who learned it from the person who had it before. Here is what I would tell anyone watching this who has an elderly person they love and a family member they're not entirely sure about. Go have the conversation about the will. Have it now, not when the person is sick, not in the weeks after a diagnosis, but now, while everyone can be clear and direct and that the conversation can happen without urgency pressing on it. Know who the attorney is, know where the documents are kept, know what the person wants, and make sure someone outside the family knows it too. A power of attorney is a powerful document, and it is given by people who trust the recipient completely, often people who have no reason yet to understand how trust can be abused. If you are helping someone set up a power of attorney, make sure there are safeguards built into it. Co-agents, required accountings, limitations on self-dealing that are explicit rather than just assumed. And if you ever see the signs I saw and chose to ignore for too long, the quicker than expected visits, the financial questions from someone who doesn't usually ask financial questions, the sense that decisions are being made just out of your line of sight, do not tell yourself you're being uncharitable. Uncharitable is survivable. The alternative, in my grandfather's case, was not. The books, as someone wiser than me once said, don't lie, pull the deed, pull the probate filing. Ask the questions out loud in a room where the answers have to go somewhere. My grandfather spent 50 years building something real on Indiana River ground. He had the foresight to put his wishes in writing, to find a trustworthy attorney, to name me by name and explain his reasoning out loud over lunch with his neighbors. He did everything right. What he couldn't do, what none of us can do in those last months when the mind is tired and the body is following, was protect himself from someone who had already decided that the opportunity was worth more than the obligation. That's what the system is supposed to do. The wills and the courts and the attorneys and the adult protective services investigators. The system is supposed to stand between a vulnerable person and the people who would take advantage of that vulnerability. Sometimes it does. In my case, with enough time and enough documentation and enough people willing to sit in a courtroom on a Wednesday and tell the truth, it did. Ray's wishes became the law again. The land is gone, but what the land was worth came back, and it's doing what Ray would have wanted it to do, which is fund the next generation of farming on Calloway ground, even if the name of the ground has changed. The brass bell from the last story rang in a feed store. Ray's landmark was a gate at the end of a gravel lane, a simple steel gate he'd hung himself in 1978 that creaked in a specific way every time you pushed it open. I took the gate when I moved out. It's on my new place now, at the end of my lane. Every morning when I drive through it, it makes the same sound it always did. And I let myself hear it the way I need to hear it, which is as continuity. As the sound of something that keeps going even when the circumstances around it have changed completely. The ground I'm farming now is mine. The work is the same work Ray taught me. The gate creaks the same creak. That's enough to build on. That's exactly enough. If this story made you think about someone you love and a conversation you've been putting off, go have that conversation this week, not next month, this week. And if you know someone who is the one in their family who shows up and does the work and assumes the paperwork will take care of itself, share this with them. The paperwork doesn't take care of itself, but the people who know how to read it, those people can take care of everything. Drop a comment below, tell me your story, or just tell me you're here.